Dambisa, welcome to Pull Up a Chair. I'm delighted to have you here today. Look, I've heard you talk really powerfully about our ability to create and sustain growth and being one of the biggest challenges of our time. And you talk about this in your books. So I just really want to start by asking you, what does sustainable growth mean to you?
Well, thank you, Bina. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's a wonderful question. I think actually it frames a lot of what's going on around the world today. So to me, sustainable growth is about creating improvements in living standards, quality of education, healthcare, infrastructure, so general public goods, national security, really human progress in a way that actually moves as many people as possible forward without reducing the livelihoods of other people. So in some sense, it's not only about inclusiveness, but it's also about being able to create improvements in living standards over time from generation to generation, which is proving to be quite difficult.
And that's really interesting you say that, because the context you give is a very long-term vision, right? Which is what I associate with sustainable growth and sustainable outcomes. And I think sometimes businesses are grappling with growth, which hasn't got the same sort of time horizon. So I know you've talked about aligning business economic growth with societal needs, which is effectively what you're saying there. And we know business and government has a role to play in the societal improvement. Could you just really give me some sort of sense of where you think business can really step up here?
Well, I think it's sort of in two parts. And I think the fact that we've in recent times dealt with a global pandemic, we've dealt with a financial crisis, we are currently dealing with conflict and geopolitical fissures, should really be a reminder of the important role that corporations play. The two parts being not just in risk mitigation, but also in investing and innovation. I think too often, and this is probably, if I were to shorthand it, too often certain regions are known for risk mitigation. So again, just to shorthand it, I think in general, people worry about climate being an area where there's been so much focus on risk mitigation, capping, greenhouse gases, all very important and crucial stuff. But what that has meant is that businesses have leaned into risk, but have maybe deprioritized the important aspects of investment. I'm giving climate as one example, but I think there's a broader context in areas of inequality, in areas of pursuing growth, where we've become far too risk mitigation focused and far too little emphasis on thinking about growth and innovation, and particularly investment as being an important piece for long-term sustainability.
So thank you for that, because that really does bring together the gift that business has to create sustainable growth. You're absolutely right. I think there's been a lot of focus on risk mitigation and compliance and making sure we're just doing what we need to do, as opposed to looking beyond and saying, how can we really drive change? But with that backlog of the challenging environment, which we are in and we have to come through, what do you think the biggest barriers are for businesses to achieve sustainable growth outside of the innovation piece?
So frankly, I think that in the immediate term, we tend to focus a lot on tactics and not enough on strategy. And I think that is problematic. And I think by tactics, I mean there's a tendency, and by the way, not just for corporations and global agencies like NGOs, but I think also government is rewarded for short-term thinking. And there's been a lot written about this, and we know about that discussion. But those tactics tend to focus on the here and now, and almost emergency reaction to, pandemics or inflation or global crises, and not enough is done about thinking about sustainable growth in a sort of structural, long-term, systemic way. And as a consequence of this problem, the short-term thinking, which again has been very much identified and discussed over time, I think you find that regulation tends to be very reactionary. I think the manner in which businesses operate, the way capital is allocated, also tends to be very short-term in terms of its thinking. And this is not to say that there hasn't been a lot of effort in the corporate boardroom or even in government to try and extend how people think through things like compensation metrics being much longer term, as an example. But I do think fundamentally the big problem that we face globally with regards to achieving sustainable growth is that we're always, whether it's government, private sector, NGOs, thinking about the immediacy and really not thinking about investing into the long term.
You talk about purpose as being the golden thread, right? And it's really important. And you've got some, incredible roles across the world in multinational companies. I'd like to understand how, from your experience, how important a strong purpose has been to the businesses you've worked with.
Yes, absolutely central. In fact, perhaps it's no surprise that I've ended up being in the boardrooms in which I serve, or in the corporations and business, but also in public policy in the areas that I found myself in. It's not a surprise because I was born and raised in a poor emerging market. Today, 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. And as far as I'm concerned, notwithstanding concerns around deglobalization and schisms between the US and China, for example, fundamentally, we're interconnected. We're interconnected in trade, we're interconnected in immigration, we're interconnected in terms of capital flows, and clearly, most recently with the global pandemic, but also with the war in Ukraine, there's more evidence that we are highly interconnected, whether it's through disease burdens, but also through prices, global prices such as food and fuel. And so with respect to your question around purpose, it feels to me that the organizations, and also that includes government, but also the third sector, the NGO sector, as we try to address some of the biggest headwinds that the global economy, but the world is facing, I think it's really important for us to understand that purpose and this need, at least in my perspective, this need for human progress is really central and really important to continue to think about, not just in an isolated way, but to really remind ourselves of the interconnectedness and this purpose of trying to improve living standards and leave the world in a better place than we find it.
You touch on something that's is really important, right? You talk about the world, you talk about 90% of the population living in emerging markets. And I think sometimes when we think about growth and sustainable, it's very local, domestic, but you talk about the interconnectedness of trade as well. So as businesses are thinking around growth in an inclusive way, I love your terminology, human progress in the broadest sense. How do you see them really dealing with and facing into those competing challenges of the environment, which we know, people, planet, and profit, so the environment, the societal, and the financial? How do you feel that they will face into that?
So I really like that question, and I think it's a wonderful, the climate issues that we have addressed or that we're facing right now, questions around the energy transition, I think is a great example, very emblematic of the tensions that businesses face, but also society continues to face. There are many others, things like globalization, things like inequality, but let me pursue the question of climate. So we are globally, with about over 8 billion people in the world today, we are consuming 100 million barrels of energy every single day, 100 million barrels. And even the most aggressive efforts for thinking about climate change efforts, net zero targets for 2050, even those aggressive efforts, things like from the International Energy Agency, still point to a very large proportion of energy being from traditional, conventional sources such as fossil fuels. So why am I raising this? I'm raising this point because even something like climate, where we can see the headwinds, we can see the costs, needs a cool-headed approach to address the fact that there's not an easy solution given the fact that we still want to continue to provide improvements in living standards for people around the world. So from a business perspective, I think very often one of the challenges that has emerged in COP26 and 27 and will be discussed, I imagine, in COP28 in UAE next year, is really this question, or this year rather, is really this question of can we try to solve the climate agenda without creating a schism between developed and developing economies? So there's no doubt about it, climate change is real. But if corporations, particularly in the West, pursue climate change or energy transition in a way that leaves emerging markets offside or makes the cost of the transition too expensive for people in poor countries to adopt, then we're not going to solve this problem of climate change. And so we need to bring everybody onto sort of the same page, and doing that requires a much more sensible and much more realistic approach to dealing with this, albeit in an aggressive way.
I love the way that you articulate the role of the collective, and so you talk about the developing and the developed, and we've seen that come through in the COP conversations. What parallels? I mean, so what I'm trying to understand is, how does business really lean into this? Because government can set the framework, the policies, but how does business really lean into this challenge and think beyond its own sphere of influence, but the bigger sphere of influence? It really can make a difference.
Yeah, so, and again, wonderful question. I'm very fortunate. I'm able to straddle business, but also what I call the public sector. So that's government, but also the NGO sector. And I would shorthand it as the following. I think in general, government and the third sector are really very focused on risk mitigation. I touched on this earlier. And that's an incredibly important role. They want to make sure that society doesn't fall apart. We don't have these externalities or second-order negative effects that impact the economy or society or human conditions, things that maybe we have not even costed as yet. So climate is a great example. For many decades, people said, well, we're growing at 4%. But actually, if you did include the cost of climate, we might not have been growing at 4%. We might be growing far lower, maybe not even growing at all. So in that respect, we do need risk mitigation, and I think government and the public sector agencies tend to be very good at thinking about regulation, thinking about curbing those costs. But you asked me about what the role of business is. I would argue that the role of business should be to invest. And that's not to invest in a careless or in a sort of sophisticated way. In other words, they should recognize costs of decisions that they make and investments. But at the same time, they really should be leaning in terms of innovation. They should be leaning in terms of being a partner for government to try and improve living standards. If I can just push the idea a little bit further, let's stick with climate. So there's no doubt about it. Government, I think, should be leaning in areas such as greenhouse gas emissions, thinking about how we can transition to this new equilibrium without continuing to harm not just society writ large, but also individual living standards. But at the same time, we expect, or we should expect, corporations to do a lot more in terms of replacing those externalities or negative costs. I want to see more investment in wind, in solar, in biofuels, in nuclear Gen 4, more innovation in thinking about what works in a profit lens, but at the same time, what does work sustainably for society. Those two things should come together, but we can't, I don't think, have an effective society where all that businesses is doing is thinking about risk mitigation and not really investing. And so the good news is that there's a lot of investment happening, nowhere near as much as we'd like to see, but this is a science problem. And so with science problems, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes R&D. And I think that's where we should be encouraging corporations to lean in and not just think about risk mitigation.
I think that's such an important topic you've just raised, right? So the partnership between government and business to make the change, but the role of business to invest. And we're beginning to see, right, businesses collaborate, collaborate with each other, collaborate with academic institutions to accelerate that pace of innovation. And the challenge is to hold your nerve and keep that moving at a pace, because the pace we need it to move at is going to be increasingly demanding as we look forward.
And maybe if I may just add on, climate is just one example. We've just come out of a pandemic. We needed the government to put in measures to mitigate or risk mitigate for the sort of expansion or the bigger risks of the pandemic. But at the same time, we also need the private sector to come up with real solutions through investing in vaccinations, doing testing, doing analysis to see what works and what doesn't. So those two things must go hand in hand. We can't just do one and expect a good longer term outcome.
Absolutely. The risk reward absolutely has to be balanced. And that's really interesting, because it sets the context for where I want to go next. We've talked about business and what business can do, but what will help business is the governance structures, the boards that actually direct those businesses. So I just want to turn to one of your more recent topics in terms of books about boards. What I'd love to explore, if you would share it with us, is the concept of balancing financial shareholder needs versus stakeholder capitalism, and how can board really think and balance those competing but not competing. They aren't competing, because we all want the end game, which is a better society and a successful society. How do we help boards do that better?
So I would say relatively slowly, as opposed to charging out. And what do I mean by that? I actually serve on the Oxford University Endowment, so I do have a very good appreciation of long-term and that tension between long-term needs of society versus the sort of immediate desires of a traditional business. I think there's a lot that comes out of your question. First of all, I say slowly. I'm not suggesting that we do nothing or we sort of navel gaze about it. But what I am saying is that we need to be much more thoughtful and not just jumping from sort of pillar to post on some of these issues that we all get excited about in the interim. But then longer term, we lose momentum or we decide to pursue something else. There are costs to these decisions, very sort of poignantly, we've spent the last sort of 5 years on a very, very clear hobby horse around ESG, rightly so, reaffirming, reassessing the important role that E, S, and G are not just for business, but for society. The Business Roundtable in 2019, reaffirming, rejigging their mandate. But without a sort of level-headed, sort of careful assessment of how we do these things, we end up with the risks as we have, for example, with the oil price going up because of the war, and realizing that many countries are heavily exposed because there's been a lack of investment in traditional energy, and there's been a lack of investment in refining, which, like it or not, as we transition in the energy transition, we still need those investments to be made, and the consequences obviously are quite being felt as we know today. But you're right that this focus around culture, around societal responsibility remains a centerpiece of what businesses. And I should argue, I don't think this is a new thing. I think it's just repackaged. If you go back in history, Henry Ford in the 1930s talked about the need to make sure that his own workers, but society was also progressing, because ultimately, in a very utilitarian way, those are the people who are going to be buying his cars. But, go back to the Quaker roots of Barclays Bank. The whole essence of the corporate entity was not just to be sort of greedy and short-term about things. It was about community and society progressing alongside. So to me, profit and progress for society were not sort of these two split sort of competing things. They were one and the same. A company that was doing well needed the community to be doing well, and vice versa. The community also needs business to be doing well so that we can have good jobs and we can have improvements in wages and living standards. But clearly, a lot has been written. I think over the years, unfortunately, business has come offside from what what sort of the messaging should be around the role that business plays for progress. I think that is changing. Again, we've seen companies step up during the pandemic. But I do think that there was a lot of work that needs to be done in reminding people that the role of business is beyond just short-term sort of profit motivations. And that's where the board's role does take a very big share of certainly my job. And maybe just one last thing. I think the other tension is that a lot of corporations, the mandate that you were talking about earlier, is a legal mandate. And so, for example, in the United States, with a Delaware LLC, legislation says that the role of the board is to primarily focus on financial shareholders. And I think very naturally over time, that did mean there was a hierarchy between financial shareholders versus society versus other needs for the community. But I think even that is being superseded by what we're actually doing in these boardrooms. So we understand that there's much more nuance that's required. And dare I say it, even Milton Friedman, who gets sort of thrown out with the baby in the bathwater, as they say, I think has been slightly misinterpreted. If you read his whole statement from 1970, he does say that the role of the board, and particularly the role of the corporation, should evolve with the needs of society. So I think there's never really been this stark dichotomy that maybe people think about business.
I think you're absolutely right. I think some of the gritty challenges that we're all facing into as civil society, as business, as governments, are such long-term, difficult things, and they're gritty that it goes outside the term or view that we would ordinarily have. And I know we do quite a lot of things together, and you've already talked about, the thing that is likely to sink a company is not identifying those risks in the longer term that are outside our immediate purview and immediate sphere of delivery or expectation. I just wanted to pick up on the culture point you made. Culture is really important to me as well. We talk about, culture is an amalgam of our behaviours, which are really driven by our values. Right? And you talked about Barclays, you talked about the alignment of values around community, purpose, and therefore delivering profit. Can I ask you what values you think are really important to get us through the next sort of period of 20, 30, 40 years?
Honestly, the answer is honesty. I think that because it sounds almost banal to say that, but I do fear that we're in a world where people are not being honest, by and large, because we are in a period where the optics or how you package something is perhaps more important than what the reality is. I gave you the example of climate change. As I said, I have not yet met somebody who doesn't believe that there's an urgent and large headwind around climate that we're dealing with, right now. But I think it would be wrong, and I think it is wrong, for anyone who's trying to really solve this problem in a sustainable way to ignore the reality, the truth, the honest fact that we are consuming 100 million barrels of energy every day, and that the choices that we make, if we do them in a sort of haphazard way, could actually really harm a lot of people. It could have knock-on effects for migration. It could make people's living standards deteriorate in a very meaningful way. So that's one example. I can give you lots of other examples, certainly in the economics realm, of how this lack of honesty about what we're really contending with. And really, when I say honesty, ultimately it's about trade-offs. We can't have everything. And so what are we willing to trade off as society? And I think, unfortunately, because of the sort of need to satiate, everybody thinks we can have everything now, as soon as possible, and really losing that perspective about the fact that these things are trade-offs. In economics 101, we used to talk about guns and butter. You don't want a society that has only guns, because then you'd starve to death. You also don't want a society that only has butter, being a euphemism for food, because then you could be invaded by your enemies. And so really the role of government and society, including business, should be trying to find that right balance. And this is, this is not great stakes. I think most people who are interested in these areas will understand that there are trade-offs. But again, I think the biggest challenge that we have is honesty, having a place where business, NGOs and government can sit down together in a very honest way to say, we have these urgent problems: inequality, demographic shifts, growth, technology, and the risk of a jobless underclass, the rise of China, illiberal states, etc. We have all these challenges, but realistically, let's be very honest about what we're going to have to trade off. And I think so honesty in and out of the boardroom is really important.
I love that, honesty, because honesty for me translates to trust. And, and we see businesses today, being transparent. And if they're transparent and then unable to deliver something, like you say, it's not the short-term gain. The decisions that boards are making today are going to have an impact beyond the tenures of those individuals in those boards, right? So I want to turn to one other thing that you've got a really good perspective on, is the type of leaders that we need. And it's not that, it's radically different to what we've had before, but how do you see leadership style or leadership traits or qualities being different as we look forward to face into this really gritty, challenge that we're trying to face into?
So your questions are great, because I think a lot of this is a lot of these questions are areas that are very live. We're dealing with, I certainly dealing with them in boardrooms, but other people are dealing with them in different contexts. And maybe just to give an example to illustrate to answer your question in a sort of roundabout way, I recently was chatting to a CEO, millennial, who said to me, Dambisa, for all the time that I've been CEO, which has been several years, you told me this last year, he said, I've actually never had, I have not had many problems to deal with. I mean, he was talking about before the pandemic. And he said, in a world where the economy is growing nicely, there don't seem to be these massive geopolitical fissures, you don't have a war, you don't have inflation, you don't have a pandemic, it was very easy to, in a way, coast. You didn't have to be aggressive in how you managed your employees, or how you thought about capital. Interest rates were low, so you could basically borrow and take chances and punts. You also did, thinking about areas of productivity, who you engaged with around the world. There weren't that many risks. He said, I just don't know how to operate in a world where we're going to have to make tough decisions about how to allocate capital and think about labor. We're in a world where there's a breakdown in trust. Things like supply chains are being disrupted, etc. I just don't know. And this is his point. I don't know how you think about that. And it's an interesting thing, because my answer to him was, well, you have to kind of experience these things in order to learn. And so, you ask me, what are the traits of a leader, a good leader in the world that's coming? I think it's somebody who's incredibly flexible. I've worked with board members to hire CEOs. When we hired the CEO, the mandate was very narrow. We want you to come in. We're happy with the number of employees that we have. We've got a great business. The person takes on the seat, and all of a sudden there's a pandemic. All of a sudden there's a war. The prices are extremely volatile, especially if you're a price taker business. So what that CEO was managed to do, or the environment, the backdrop that they thought they were coming into, where they thought maybe they would be able to borrow lots of money, do some R&D, do some innovation, is very different. Interest rates are higher now. You've got inflation. How do you think about that environment? And so, I actually despise the word agile because I think it's way overused. But in a sense, you do need somebody who's flexible enough to say, gosh, I now have to think about how to run a business, a global business in a pandemic. I thought the cost of capital would be X. It's actually X plus, 200 basis points. I thought that I could build my products cheaply in China and ship them over to the UK. That's gone. I thought that we wouldn't have Brexit. We do. That's just a reality. So how do I think about these very emergent things that I have very little control over, the exogenous factors that are coming at me? And so it really is about having those types of very dynamic leaders who are curious and who are willing to change direction very quickly. There's been a lot written. Harvard Business Review, there's an article that I talk about this idea of having a peacetime versus a wartime leader. And from the board, you hire in a CEO to address a certain type of situation. If you feel like you need to reduce the costs burden of an organization, you'd hire much more of what they call a wartime leader, somebody who knows how to restructure and realign costs. If you're in a low interest rate environment and there's a real opportunity for innovation, you'd hire somebody they'd call more of a peacetime type of business. But what happens if you've hired a peacetime CEO and all of a sudden you're in wartime conditions? You need somebody who's going to be able to adapt. So long-winded way of saying that I think adaptability and being able to understand how quickly dynamics change, and not sitting there thinking, it's going to be fine, so it's going to be the same, but really leaning into change, I think, is the kind of leaders that we need.
And I'm really pleased you said that, because coming from a restructuring background myself, working in a world of ambiguity, you know where you need to get to, but there is also lots of moving parts, which is exactly where we're in. So I think that sums it up really nicely, being flexible, being agile, because we actually don't know what's going to hit us tomorrow, but you need to be open-minded to move, but with a clear vision of where you're heading.
Yeah.
With that clear vision in mind, as an economist, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you how optimistic you feel around, the UK economy and the global economy over the coming period.
Yeah, so it's interesting because people in different environments ask me about a local region. So sometimes if I'm in the US, they'll say, what do you think about the US economy? And then what do you think about the global economy? If I'm in Asia or in Africa, people ask me about their economy and then the global economy. I see everything as interlinked. And I think, for a number of reasons, we've talked about trade and immigration and capital flows and all these things as being interlinked. Therefore, it seems to me quite unnatural to expect a country to be doing phenomenally well where the rest of the world is in a challenge, or vice versa. So maybe I'll cheat a little bit and I'll answer in sort of together as opposed to splitting them out. Look, I published a book called The Edge of Chaos in 2018, where I outlined a number of structural problems. Nothing surprising, Bina. I know you would recognize all of them, but structural problems that the global economy was dealing with at that time. Things like technology and the risk of a jobless underclass. The fact that technology was moving at such a pace, we were losing jobs. What were we going to do with relatively large populations of people who did not have work? Demographic shifts. When I wrote that book, we were at 7.5, maybe higher, 7.8 billion people. You now know from the United Nations report from last September, October, we're now over 8 billion people. When I wrote the book, China was the largest economy. There's now evidence that India is the largest economy. I talked about inequality, not just inequality between countries, developed and developing countries, for example, but also within countries, inequality was becoming a problem. Natural resources, not just natural resource scarcity, but also the stuff we've been talking about earlier about climate and how do we transition from a heavily conventional energy base to a new base, and also a headwind. How do we do that in a way? We've seen the evidence of CO2 emissions continuing to get bigger, even though we were all at home under quarantine. This is a real headwind. Debt, the sheer amount of debt the global economy is carrying, productivity decline. So there are all these headwinds. Since I wrote that book, we've had a global pandemic. I didn't even talk about a global pandemic at that time, and we now have a war, certainly in Europe. To my mind, these things are catalyzing the problems that I outlined in a structural way. So what does that mean? It means that I'm not as euphoric as I would like to be about the trajectory or the path of the world. The rule of thumb that I've used quite a bit is that in order to double per capita incomes, and again, I'm an economist, my PhD is in economics, so I tend to focus on economics, but in order to double per capita incomes in one generation, a generation is 25 years, we need to be growing by 3% per year. And you just look around the world today, many countries are not growing anywhere near 3%. In fact, as you know, forecasting a recession for this year. So I would argue, we're on a fundamentally not on the right path. There are things that we hadn't planned for, like the war, like inflation, that have, some people say they're very much linked, ideological fissures, all these things we hadn't really planned for. And I don't see those things going away in the interim, which leaves me with a very sort of unsettled perspective. Maybe just one other thing, we now have about 100 million refugees and displaced people, the highest on record according to the International Refugee Committee. So we've got a lot of these problems. I'm generally an optimist. The question ultimately is what should we be doing about this? I hope that we're now in a place where things have gotten to such fever pitch that we are going to come together. And by coming together, I mean across countries. We can't solve these problems by keeping China offside, for example. But I also think it's important for us to come together, business, public sector, as well as NGOs, to, as I said, be honest about what we're really contending with and coming up with real solutions. So I'm afraid I'm not that sanguine, but my mother always says, we put a man on the moon. I think we can solve poverty and we can solve these problems if we really lean into them in an honest way.
So Dambisa, maybe you could sort of leave us with some optimism about what we can see or expect to see as we look forward.
Yeah, and I think the word optimism is really important because the purpose of identifying problems or identifying economic headwinds or societal headwinds is not for us to just navel gaze and throw our hands in the air and say, well, gosh, it's really awful. It's really to come up with more innovation and real opportunities to address these challenges. I actually remain optimistic. I think there are lots of reasons we should be optimistic. We're living in an era of immense speed of technology. Just to pick on technology, the ability for technology not just to create networks like a Facebook or to improve consumerism like an Amazon, but really to append public goods like education and healthcare. Access and quality for people around the world is immense, and I think we should be excited about that and that prospect. And so, I don't want to be sort of Pollyannish about it, as they say, but I want to be to say that the reason we identify these problems is to help us to come up with the right solutions to accelerate sustainable growth and to improve progress for all.
And I think you've given everybody listening to this podcast some real food for thought about the mindset required to take us through. So that's been incredible. I just want to talk a little bit about you, if that's okay. Incredibly accomplished author, businesswoman, and now Baroness. If you could go back in time to the young Dr. Dambisa, well, actually would have been before then, Dambisa, what advice would you have given yourself?
I think I would have told myself that something somebody said to me, no doesn't mean never, it means not now. And I really like that because, my best friend is a chairman of Starbucks, and she and I joke about how, when we show up on a podcast or in an interview or in a boardroom, it looks fully packaged. But there have been a lot of no's and a lot of disappointments along the way that maybe the outside just doesn't see. And yet looking back, those no's, the times when the door was slammed in my face, certainly, were not really to say it's never going to happen. It was just I wasn't ready, and perhaps I needed to be more patient or more understanding that I needed better skills, I needed to have better experiences, and I needed to lean into curiosity and to continuing to learn to have those opportunities become yeses. And so I think too often, particularly in the world that we're in right now, and I'm over 50, so I'm in a different generation, but I worry a lot that people want things and they want them now. And if you say no, then, oh my gosh, it must mean that you're a racist or you're anti-woman, or without really understanding that there's a process. I think, and by the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying that misogyny and racism don't exist. I'm just saying that it's a dangerous place for the individual, but for society, I think if people don't understand that there's a process to learning, and there will be setbacks and disappointments, and that just because somebody said, no, I'm not giving you this job, or no, I'm not giving you a promotion, doesn't mean that it's never going to happen. And I think it's often the onus is on us to say, okay, you've told me no, what do I need to do to be eligible? So no doesn't mean never, it just means not now.
It's a lovely way to articulate the importance of resilience.
Yes.
You know, we talk about resilience as being bouncing back, but it is about not bouncing back to something that's necessarily the negative. It's
exactly.
about how do I get to the next level.
Exactly right, exactly right.
Lovely bit of advice there. We've been talking about sustainable growth, and we've looked at it in the broadest sense possible from an economic, societal, and environmental. How do you sustain yourself? Because I know you're a very, very busy lady, so how do you sustain yourself?
Well, I don't know what you mean. Do you mean,
well, how
do I go to the gym every day, or do you mean like, do I intellectually, how do I stimulate myself?
How do you keep yourself so grounded and sane? Because you do a lot, right? You're in, you've got many roles, but how do you keep yourself energized and motivated?
Yeah, so for me, the most important thing is, believe it or not, actually, I like to spend time with people who are much older than I am. Some people will say that's probably why I've ended up in the Lord's. But I think really pursuing relationships with people who are in their 80s, older than that, has been really beneficial for me. And it might sound like, how does that sustain you? It does, because I do think that there's always a historical context. There's a lot of information that is lost if you don't read. I read a lot. And so and more I'm reading history, because I do think, gosh, there's a lot of patterns, a lot of things, a lot of learnings that get lost because we think we're here and now and this must be the first time this ever happened. No, it's not. And so how did past generations learn? But spending time with older people, for me, has been incredibly valuable. And it might be just because, I was born and raised in Africa. And in Africa, there's a lot of reverence for older people. They have so much wisdom. They have so much perspective. They understand how you should be investing your time, I think, and the networks and sort of societal relationships you should be building at whatever age you're at. And so that's how I sustain myself. They encourage curiosity. I think there's a lot of, right now I'm quite obsessed with this whole idea of mixed mental models, which Charlie Munger, I get another, I think he's going to be 100, or he just turned 100 years old, another fount of wisdom. But this idea that when you look at a problem, don't just look at it from one lens. So in my case, don't just look at it from economics. Think about the same question from a biological thread or anthropological lens, or political science or other areas. So this idea of mixed mental models, to me, it's very fascinating. I'm getting very sustained by that right now, and trying to really challenge my beliefs and understanding. So that's what I would say.
I'm not surprised, Dambisa, because you're a lifelong learner. You are a lifelong learner. But I can relate to that reverence to elders, that fast forwarding of the wisdom and experiences that come from times and situations that can sometimes be harsher than the ones we're facing into. So Dambisa, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. We've just covered so much, and it's been an incredibly interesting, broad-ranging conversation. We started off around that core the core purpose around human progress, and the role of society, business, and government in that longer term, talent. How do you manage that tension between long term, short term, risks, investments? But the three words I'm going to take away from this interview, I think really, really resonate. The interconnectedness. It's not just a geographical thing, it is a stakeholder thing as well. The second is honesty, which to me goes back to the heart of trust and transparency to actually get to the same place in the end. And then the third, which I think all of us can do, and it comes back to your very last point, is that flexibility of thinking, flexibility of approach, and openness to dealing with things in a way that we're not necessarily always used to.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know. We don't know is the bottom line. We don't. We all may think we know, but we don't. And so I think having that, coming to problems and challenges with that attitude is much more healthy.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thanks.